Starship gets a launch date for its next flight, the future of the ISS gets complicated, ISAR fires up its Spectrum rocket ahead of its first launch, and this NASA lunar module is ready for its trip to the US. As always, we'll have all that and more coming up this week in Spaceflight. It's been another week, which means we've got a bunch more lunar stories to cover. Firefly's Blue Ghost lander has entered orbit around the moon and has started to maneuver itself to lower orbits in preparation for its upcoming landing. The lander fired up its main engine and reaction control thrusters on February 14th at 1:51 UTC for 4 minutes and 15 seconds to insert itself into orbit around the moon. This initial orbit of roughly 150 by 5,700 kilometers was just preliminary, as the lander executed another burn on February 18th at 9:09 UTC that changed it to a roughly 100 by 150 kilometer orbit, bringing it much closer to the lunar surface. Blue Ghost will spend another few days in lunar orbit getting ready for landing and waiting for proper sunlight conditions at the landing site near Mare Frigoris. Firefly is aiming for this to take place no earlier than March 2nd at 8:45 UTC. There's another moonbound lunar lander, Hakuto-R, which also recently made a close approach to the moon, but has not yet entered into orbit around it. The lander, called Resilience, passed within 8,400 kilometers of the moon on February 15th. This is part of the spacecraft's long trip around the Earth-Moon system on what's called a low-energy trajectory. Resilience used the lunar gravity to tweak its orbit, bringing it into the right position to swing it back towards Earth and kick it out to about 1.1 million kilometers from our planet. This longer trajectory will make it arrive in the vicinity of the moon in early May at a lower speed, needing less fuel to enter orbit around it. The lander is expected to arrive a few weeks after that in the Mare Frigoris area of the moon. Meanwhile, at the Kennedy Space Center, NASA has completed stacking the solid rocket boosters for the SLS rocket that will launch the Artemis II mission. The agency's Exploration Ground Systems program started this process in November by placing the aft sections of these boosters on the Mobile Launcher 1. This was followed weeks later by the other 4 solid-fueled segments that make up each of the boosters, including the ones featuring the iconic NASA worm logo. This week, the program capped off the boosters by installing their forward assemblies, more commonly known as the booster nose cones. This milestone in the rocket stacking should soon be followed by the placement and attachment of the SLS core stage in between both of the boosters. That core stage uses 2 flight-proven RS-25 engines and 2 new RS-25 engines that were made from leftover parts from the Space Shuttle program. But NASA prepared for a future when this hardware would run out and has ordered L3 Harris to start production of this venerable engine, but this time using more modern and improved manufacturing techniques. This week, the agency announced that the first of these new RS-25 engines have completed manufacturing and are now on the test stand at the Stennis Space Center. This new engine will soon be brought to life, so check back on a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight for some fiery action. And speaking of things that will go to the moon, NASA and its international partners are working on the upcoming Lunar Gateway space station. It's sort of a spiritual successor to the International Space Station, as it's the next generation of a global collaboration to learn how to live and operate in space. But this time, it'll be in deep space near the moon. This week, Gateway reached an important milestone as the pressure vessel for its first module is now completed and ready to be shipped to Northrop Grumman. This module is called the Habitation and Logistics Outpost, or HALO for short. While Northrop Grumman is the main contractor for this module, the pressure vessel was built by Thales Alenia Space. NSF's own Adrian Bile went to Turin in Italy to see the module up close before it's sent to the United States for its next phase, and had a chance to speak to a number of people who work on the program.
I'm here at Thales Alenia Space, where they are getting ready to deliver the first Gateway module to Northrop Grumman, which is the HALO module.
It's a very important occasion for us to be here with our customers. This is the result of a long series of efforts for which we can provide state-of-the-art primary structures for our customers. Also because we will have to host human beings in a very harsh environment like the big space of the lunar environment.
Thales Alenia is now getting ready to pack up the module and send it to Northrop Grumman's facilities in Arizona.
So we at Northrop Grumman then begin outfitting HALO with all the systems that make it from a structure into a habitable module for the astronauts. So environmental support systems, thermal control systems, all the flight computers, radios, etc. that go inside the structure. To the outside of the vehicle, we attach thermal radiators, which are actually aluminum structures that are coated with a very specific white paint to allow them to reject heat to space. And when you see a rendering of the vehicle, you'll see those white squares that represent the thermal radiators. There are also a number of large pieces of equipment that will be mounted to the outside of the vehicle. Part of that thermal control system and the pump package is mounted outside, as well as the Lunar Link comm system will be mounted to the outside of the vehicle. During that time, we build everything out, and then we head through a series of environmental tests to ensure that everything was properly installed and is working, and then we pack it up and ship it off to the Cape for launch in 2027.
Before launching Halo, NASA will join the module to Gateway's Power and Propulsion Element, or PPE. This module will provide the station with electricity and also provide propulsion to maintain its orbit. The two modules will launch together on a Falcon Heavy in late 2027.
Maxar is doing a tremendous job as well with integrating the power and propulsion element. There's a lot of the integration of that spacecraft that has already happened, and there's more coming the rest of this year. We're expecting them to get into spacecraft level testing next year, again to support a launch in 2027.
But Gateway will be larger than just Halo and PPE, and that is where NASA's international partners come in.
The international partnerships that we have with partners that existed on ISS that transfer into Gateway as well. So we've got ESA, we've got CSA, we've got JAXA all as a partnership, and we've added Mohammed bin Rashid Space Center of United Arab Emirates to that as well. So they're all with us in Gateway, and we're taking heritage from all of those aspects, feeding that into what we're doing for Gateway. Thales Alenia Space in particular has produced a lot of components that have supported those activities for decades.
One of the modules provided by the European Space Agency is the Lunar iHab that hosts the main living quarters for the astronauts on board the station. This module is currently scheduled to launch on Artemis 4 in 2028, which will also be the first time that astronauts get to visit Gateway. ESA astronaut Matthias Maurer explained the importance of having more than one module.
Behind me is the iHab. The iHab has also a different engineering part in the entire architecture. So without the iHab, we couldn't stay for up to 90 days, because there we have the air revitalization system. We also have our crew quarters, and we have our area where we can sit together and or float together, I should say, and eat together. So it provides also an important part for the living quality on the station. But with Halo, we already can live up there.
But why does NASA need a whole space station to go to the moon? Well, I recently asked Matt Mixavany from NASA Marshall's Human Exploration and Development Operations when he visited the Intrepid Museum.
NASA's looking for ways with its international partners to find ways for humans to live sustainably in space for long periods of time. And Gateway is one key essential part of the architecture. So the idea here is, whether you are going to the moon or going to Mars, you have to live and operate in deep space for a long period of time.
So Gateway will play an important role in getting astronauts back to the moon and maybe even further. Operating this station will teach NASA and its international partners how to keep astronauts alive and healthy in deep space for prolonged periods of time. And that's important if we want to go further than just planting another flag on the moon.
I think with Gateway, we are entering the golden age of moon exploration. We start with 3 flights to the Gateway, but this is not the end, and so there will be more.
If you want to keep up with the latest news on lunar exploration and other space news, subscribe and hit the bell to get notified when we go live or upload our next episode. And while you're at it, why not give us a like too? Unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably noticed that there's been a lot of discussion lately about the astronauts that are currently on board the International Space Station. Now, it can be confusing to keep up with all of the operations going on up there, and it's not easy to schedule the lives and work of 7 people inside the largest spacecraft ever assembled in orbit, while also having to juggle the comings and goings of about a dozen vehicles that supply it. Now, you might remember that last week we covered the recent news about NASA and SpaceX changing their plans for the Crew 10 mission, which would result in NASA astronauts Sunita Williams and Butch Wilmore coming home just a bit earlier than previously planned. To better understand this, let's look at how the crew rotations on the ISS normally work. For the last 4 years or so, the ISS has been continuously staffed by 7 crew members, 3 as part of the Russian side of the station, and 4 as part of the US operating side of the station. The crews go up on Soyuz and Crew Dragon spacecraft, spending roughly 6 months each time. When Sunny and Butch went up to the ISS in June of last year as part of the Starliner crew flight test, they joined the crews that were already on the station. 4 members of the Crew 8 mission, and 3 members of the Soyuz MS-25 mission. At that time, the Crew 8 and Soyuz MS-25 crews were already there 3 and 2 months into their missions respectively. The original plan was for Sunny and Butch to visit the station for a short period of time and then return to Earth on board the Starliner. Unfortunately, multiple issues with the Starliner threw a wrench into this simple plan. 2 months later, in August, NASA made the decision to send Starliner back to Earth empty, given the uncertainty regarding how that spacecraft would perform on its way back. This, of course, was based on the fact that it had had thruster issues while going to the ISS. Luckily, NASA had another option: SpaceX's Crew Dragon. Dragon is operational and can be used to return the astronauts back home, so this was a viable option to pursue, and the agency decided to keep them on station until February. While this prompted a lot of headlines in the mainstream media, according to NASA, the reasoning behind the decision all came down to the ISS visiting vehicle schedule and the crew's normal schedule on orbit. The plan before all of the Starliner drama was to launch Crew 9 with its own set of 4 crew members in late August to relieve the crew from the Crew 8 mission, allowing them to come back home. Soyuz MS-26 would then launch a few weeks later to do the same with Soyuz MS-25. The crew of Crew 9 would have spent roughly 6 months on the ISS and come back around February of this year once Crew 10 launched up into the station. But with 2 extra astronauts on the station, NASA made some tweaks to the crew seating. Crew 9 would instead launch with only 2 crew members, leaving 2 seats open for Sunny and Butch. They essentially would become part of the Crew 9 mission and have spent their time on station as such, with the plan to return with that crew. Add to that, Crew 9 was also delayed to launch a month later in late September to accommodate this change in plans. Crew 8 eventually came back home in late October due to weather. The Crew 10 crew would launch in early February as previously planned, relieve the crew of Crew 9, and then they'd be free to come back home. By coming home as part of Crew 9 later in February, the 2 extra astronauts were accommodated with a minimal shakeup of the regular schedule. But there have been some interesting comments lately from Elon Musk about all of this. The CEO of SpaceX has said for the last few weeks that this decision was actually political in nature and that he'd offered an alternative plan to return Sunny and Butch but was refused. According to his latest comments on his own social media company X, Musk says, quote, "SpaceX could have brought the astronauts back last year, but Biden pushed the return past the inauguration date." But let's take a look at the schedule, because if the crew stays on the ISS typically for about 6 months anyway, even if the Starliner drama hadn't happened, Crew 9 still would have returned in the month of February under the original plan for them to launch in August. So by having Sunny and Butch become part of Crew 9, they were meant to return after the inauguration no matter what. Now, if you watched last week's episode of This Week in Spaceflight, you may have seen that recently their return was delayed even further to March due to a variety of issues related to preparing the Crew 10 mission for launch. According to Eric Berger, author of 2 books narrating the founding of SpaceX and the development of Falcon 9.
Well, I can't say this for certain, but a couple people have said that there were some battery issues with the spacecraft development or production processing.
It's possible that SpaceX could have used one of their capsules to launch a one-off mission to return Sunny and Butch on a dedicated Dragon flight, but that's not as easy as it sounds.
The problem is that if you bring Crew 9 home, you've only got one person, Don Pettit, on the space station, right? And that's not good for NASA's operations because one person can barely maintain the U.S. segment of the facility. And so that's why you always wanted to wait for a handover, right, with Crew 9 and 10.
At the time of the decision in August of last year, SpaceX had 3 capsules on the ground, each one in different phases of processing for launch. Crew Dragon Resilience was being prepared for the launch of Polaris Dawn, Endurance had been assigned for the From 2 mission, and Freedom was being prepared for the Crew 9 mission. Given this, pretty much every capsule was already assigned to a mission, so sending one of them up on a one-off trip would have also required modifications to the capsule assignments and the crew rotations to the ISS. NASA's Steve Stitch laid this out in a press conference back in August, just a week before the final decision was made to bring back Sunny and Butch on Crew 9. At the time, the agency laid out the potential options and was asked about a dedicated mission with Dragon.
Yeah, relative to sending up a new Dragon so that Butch and Sunny didn't have to stay up till February, we really never considered that option from the very beginning. We liked the option of modifying Crew 9 or Crew 8. We looked at both of those and bringing them back either one of those vehicles. We're trying to lay out the rest of our manifest, to make sure we have vehicles available for all the flights. And it just didn't make sense to go ahead and accelerate a flight, SpaceX, to return Butch and Sunny earlier.
Carrying out a one-off mission would have impacted the availability of the Dragon fleet for the missions that would be needed in the immediate future. It seems that NASA's simplest solution was to keep the option to have a regular crew rotation mission while also bringing back Sunny and Butch. No matter what, given the Starliner's problems, it wouldn't have changed the end result. Dragon is the only U.S. spacecraft that NASA can use to return them home. Sunny and Butch aside, this isn't the only proposal that Elon has in mind for the ISS program. According to another post, he thinks that, quote, "It's time to begin preparations for deorbiting the space station," adding, in a reply to Eric Berger, that his recommendation is to retire it in just 2 years' time.
I didn't wake up today expecting to see Elon Musk, one of the most powerful people in the world, saying we should end the International Space Station program in 2 years. That certainly is going to be news to NASA.
The ISS is currently headed for retirement in 2030, and in fact, just last year, NASA awarded a contract to SpaceX to develop the US deorbit vehicle, a US-made spacecraft meant to do just that. So essentially, this proposal would bring that schedule forward by 3 years. That said, this would still need to be approved by all of the other ISS partner countries, as it also contains their hardware and, of course, their own crews in the case of the Russian segment. It also means that they'd need to accelerate the development of SpaceX's deorbiting vehicle so that it can even support a deorbit in 2027. What still isn't clear with this plan, though, is how we can maintain continuous presence of humans in orbit, since once the ISS is deorbited, the only remaining station up there would be the Chinese Tiangong station. China would essentially be the only option for space companies around the world to partner with for science or technological research in space until other commercial stations are launched. But even now, most of those are still in the early stages of development. So if there's any takeaway, it's this. Space logistics are a lot more complicated than they seem, but it's also possible to make them even more confusing than they need to be. Now we'll take a glimpse at some other stories across space, starting with some good news! Remember that asteroid that we reported on a few episodes back? Well, for a while it seemed increasingly more likely that it would hit the Earth in 2032, but that probability has rapidly decreased in the last few days. So what's going on here? Let me explain. Astronomers need to measure the asteroid's orbit to determine where it's going to be in the future, but it's impossible to measure an asteroid's orbit with 100% certainty. As a result, astronomers can't predict an asteroid's future position down to a single point, but instead to a range that the asteroid will pass through. For our asteroid, that range overlapped with Earth in late 2032, so that meant that there was a chance that it could hit our home planet. But as astronomers measured the asteroid's orbit more precisely over the past few days, the area got smaller and smaller and smaller. The Earth, of course, didn't change size though, so it took up a larger proportion of that area, and thus the chance of impact increased all the way to 3.2%. Now, this even exceeded the highest previously predicted chance of impact held by asteroid Apophis, which, shortly after its discovery in 2004, was briefly thought to have a 2.7% chance of impacting Earth in 2029. But don't worry, that one is now down solidly to 0%. Anyway, predictions for this current asteroid didn't stop there. As the trajectory of its orbit became more and more precise, the area of impact became much smaller, and now it seems more and more likely that the asteroid will miss the Earth entirely, and the probability of impact is still going down rapidly, with the latest percentage being reported at only 0.28%. So that is one less thing for us to worry about now. Whew! This week, German company ISAR Aerospace announced that it successfully performed a static fire of the first stage of its rocket called Spectrum. This rocket is 2 meters wide and 28 meters tall, powered by propane, and will be capable of delivering 1,000 kilograms into low Earth orbit. On February 14th, Spectrum fired up its 9 first-stage engines for a 30-second static fire after performing a similar test with the rocket's upper stage last year. With both stages successfully tested, ISAR is now ready for its first flight from the Andøya spaceport in Norway. With Spectrum's flight from that site, it'll be the first launch of an orbital rocket from continental Europe. There's only one thing holding them up, though: a launch license. ISAR is getting ready to fly Spectrum as soon as the Norwegian Civil Aviation Authority signs off on that all-important paperwork, with the exact launch date to be decided as part of the licensing procedure. We'll be sure to tell you all about it in a future episode of This Week in Spaceflight. Now let's take a look at the space traffic of the week and see what's coming up next week in spaceflight. Starting off the week, we had a Starlink launch on February 15th. Falcon 9 lit its 9 Merlin engines at 6:14 UTC and lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida. Of the 21 Starlink V2 mini satellites deployed, 13 had direct-to-cell capability. The booster for this mission was B-1067, which flew for the 26th time and also became the first to fly that many times. During its 26 missions, this booster carried crew twice on Cruise 3 and 4. It also flew 2 cargo resupply missions and 15 Starlink flights, including the one from this week. The booster successfully wrapped up its latest mission, by landing on drone ship a shortfall of gravitas. For our next space traffic event, we're heading to Venus. Europe's solar orbiter passed by the planet this week, and its orbit will never be the same again. On February 18th at 21:48 Universal Time, solar orbiter screamed past Venus at an altitude of 379 kilometers. That's even closer to Venus than the astronauts on the ISS are to Earth. As the spacecraft swung past Venus, it used the planet's gravity to change its orbit around the sun, and because of that, these flybys are also known as gravity assists. As Solar Orbiter flew by Venus, it kept its instruments pointed at the sun. However, teams did turn on some of the spacecraft's sensors to study the plasma and magnetic environment around the planet. With this week's gravity assist, Solar Orbiter changed the inclination, or tilt, of its orbit. This was the spacecraft's 4th Venus flyby, and it's set to perform 4 more, with the next one scheduled for December 24th, 2026. That flyby will further change the inclination, so the spacecraft is able to get a good view of the sun's polar regions. We also had an Electron launch this week, and in fact, it was the rocket's 60th flight. On February 18th at 23:17 UTC, Electron took off from Rocket Lab's own launch complex in New Zealand. The payload on this mission was an Earth observation satellite for Black Sky. This was the first flight for the company's 3rd generation of satellites, which can image our planet at a 50-centimeter resolution. Only 4 minutes later, another mission took flight from the other side of the world. This was, you guessed it, another Starlink mission, but with a twist. Falcon 9 lifted off from Florida, carrying 23 V2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. What was different this time was the booster's landing location, as it was right in the middle of the Bahamas, and this was the first time Falcon 9 has flown that trajectory. But why did it go there? Well, it all has to do with the target orbit of this batch of Starlink satellites, which has a 53-degree inclination. To get to this orbit, Falcon 9 usually flies northeast, but rough seas can make recovery challenging in the winter months, so SpaceX prefers to go southeast instead. However, that also requires flying a large dogleg trajectory around the Bahamas, which wastes a lot of performance. Well, last year, SpaceX signed an agreement with the Bahamian government, allowing the company to position its recovery assets in the country's territorial waters. With this agreement, SpaceX can land Falcon 9 in much calmer seas without the need for costly dogleg maneuvers. With this flight, B-1080 became the first booster to explore this new route on its 16th flight. It landed successfully on the deck of drone ship Just Read the Instructions, and we were also able to get some beautiful views of the landing from one of the Bahamian islands. Closing out the week, we had another Starlink mission on February 21st. This mission lifted off from Space Launch Complex 40 in Florida and carried another batch of Starlink direct-to-cell satellites and V2 minis into low Earth orbit. Then the booster ended its mission by successfully touching down on the deck of a shortfall of gravitas. With this week's 3 Starlink missions, SpaceX now has launched a total of 7,996 Starlink satellites into orbit, of which 915 have re-entered and 6,268 have moved into their operational orbit. Going into next week, we'll have a Changzheng 3B launch from China on February 22nd. Liftoff is scheduled around 12:10 UTC from the Xichang Satellite Launch Center in China. Then a Starlink mission is set to lift off from California later that day. Falcon 9 will take flight during a 4-hour window starting at 22:24 UTC. This will be the first mission of Starlink Group 15, which differs from previous groups with its 70-degree inclination. Another Starlink mission is scheduled for February 24th. This mission will be conducted from Florida, with T0 set during a 4-hour window starting at 4:42 UTC. According to airspace restrictions, we may also have Starship's 8th flight next week. The flight profile for this mission will likely be a redo of Flight 7, but the ship will hopefully get a little further along this time around. If all goes well, Starship might lift off on February 26th during a roughly 1 hour and 40-minute window opening at 23:30 UTC. Backup windows will also be available in the following days. The next mission will go to the moon. On February 27th, Falcon 9 is set to lift off at 17 minutes past midnight UTC, carrying the IM-2 mission for Intuitive Machines. This mission will be conducted from Launch Complex 39A at the Kennedy Space Center. In addition to IM-2, the flight will carry 4 more payloads, 2 of which are destined for geostationary orbit, and the other 2 will join IM-2 on its way to the moon. Later that day, a Soyuz will take off from Kazakhstan, carrying the Progress MS-30 cargo resupply mission to the International Space Station. Liftoff is scheduled for 21:24 Universal Time on February 27th. And wrapping up the week and the month of February, we'll have another Starlink mission from Cape Canaveral. This time, Falcon 9 will carry another batch of direct-to-cell and B2 mini satellites into low Earth orbit. The 4-hour launch window for this flight opens at 2:52 Universal on February 28th. And that's your weekly update of spaceflight news. I'm Alicia Siegel for NSF, and we'll see you all again next week to recap this week in spaceflight.